cameras and their microphones on, if we can please, because of the number of people on this call, just switch cameras and mics off, that would be fantastic. I think we're almost there now. But yeah, sorry. So a huge welcome. My name is Oliver Mackey. I'm Strategic Service Manager for the NSPCC. And I'm going to be the host today for the session, introducing Professor Kieran McCartan shortly. But before I do that, you bear with us with the technology slightly while I just share my screen and bring up. Okay. Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping. So yeah, I'm still unfortunately getting a little bit of interference as someone's mic's still on. If that could be switched off, that'd be great. Just to tell people that there is a chat function available that you can use. If you want to pose questions, please do pose those questions in the chat, and there will be time towards the end of the session for us to respond to some questions that have been raised during the session. For those of you that don't have the chat function, don't worry. There is a hand signal up in the top taskbar. If you're not familiar with Teams, you can raise your hand, and if we get the chance at the end, we will come to you to ask some questions. Oh, sorry, slight technology. Okay. I just wanted to kind of give a bit of a health warning around the subject area. It's a fantastic week of events and sessions, but the subject area for any of us can pose triggers. So and trauma can affect us all. So I want just to kind of a bit of a health warning to be conscious of the environment that you're in. Some of the subject matter we'll be talking about obviously is around child sexual abuse and prevention of child sexual abuse, and to be conscious of any triggers that might affect you, and to kind of remind everyone that to talk to someone, to reach out to NSPC after session if you feel that any of it has affected you in any way. We're here to help signpost to any help or support. And really, most important thing, I want you to enjoy what is a fantastic week. It's part of our Together for Childhood program here in Plymouth to prevent child sexual abuse. We are really fortunate to have a number of speakers from both national and international this week lined up to talk to you about their area of expertise and practice, and also to hear from agencies and local organisations who are working in the field of preventing offending and harmful sexual behaviour to share what they do and to really kickstart the conversation even more locally about how we can all get involved in preventing harm. Hopefully you can see my slides at the end there. There's also some opportunity to get involved on social media. We've got our Twitter tag, which is @TFC Plymouth. We've got our Facebook Together for Childhood Plymouth page. Please like or follow it.
All right.
Please use the if you are tweeting, please use the hashtag TFC Conference 2021. Okay. I'm still getting, sorry, just last reminder, just because I don't want Kieran, I'm going to invite Kieran on a minute, to be constantly interrupted by people's mics or background. I know it's hard to remember these things, but if you're like me, I often spend most of my time actually on mute rather than off mute on calls by accident. But if we can please just check that we're muted, that would be really, really fantastic. So I'm going to now stop sharing my screen. And you've got to bear with us. We'd love to be in a real conference situation, but the virtual world of conferencing does bring with it many benefits. But just bear with us with the technology today. I'm sure you'll be kind to us as we try and take you through the session. But I'd really like to give a really warm welcome to Professor Kieran McCartan. I was about to do an intro to you, Kieran, and then I was looking through the list of roles that you hold and thinking, gosh, how lucky are we to have managed to get a bit of space in your schedule. So Kieran is professor at the University of the West of England, Bristol, in the Sociology and Criminology department. He is adjunct professor in criminology, professor in criminology in the School of Justice, Queensland University of Technology. Visiting Research Fellow for the Centre for Applied Childhood, Youth and Family Research in the University of Huddersfield. He is the International Chair and Executive Board Member of the Association of the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, running up until 2023. And he is the Conference Chair and Executive Board Member of the National Organisation for the Treatment of Abuse, otherwise known as NOTA, for some of us who have engaged in some of their fantastic events. I hope I've got all that right, Kieran. Yeah, so we're really warm welcome to Kieran. He's going to take us through his area of knowledge and expertise today. I will hand over to Kieran and give him a second while he says hello and does the tech thing and shares screen.
That's great, Oliver. Thank you. Can people hear me okay? Can you hear me through the joys of modern technology? Thank you. I'm just going to get my share screen sorted out while we're talking. So hopefully everyone can see my screen now.
We can, Kieran, yeah.
Brilliant. So a couple of quick things. I'm really pleased to be here, really pleased to be taking part in this. Oh God, 2 years ago, God, although it feels like a lifetime ago, I remember being in a venue in Warrington when this was all kicking off, and we were talking about what the scope and the aims for the project were, and they seemed quite ambitious back then. But you know, given the what we've been going through for the past year, myself and Oliver were just talking about it, that today's the anniversary of lockdown. But given that, and given all the other issues that come with it, it's absolutely fantastic that we've gotten to this point, as it is. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about taking a public health approach to sexual abuse and understanding the reality of sexual abuse and what that means in moving forward. And as Oliver said, bit of a trigger warning, like we're not going to go into graphic detail about sexual abuse and child sexual abuse and sexual violence, but we are going to be using the language, you know, we are going to be talking around them. My plan is to talk for about 45 minutes and then to leave some time for questions afterwards. I'm very happy to answer any and every question. Now, what I will say is I'm not looking at the chat function. So if you are putting questions in the chat, I think someone from the NSPCC will be picking them up, so they will be captured, but I'm just going to do the talk and then we'll come to the questions afterwards. If you keep wondering why I'm looking this way, I've got two screens and all you lovely people are on one screen and the PowerPoint's on the other screen. So it's not that I've been distracted by Wayfair or I'm trying to do my Tesco shopping at the same time. So, you know, do bear with me. So getting started, why does community matter when it comes to sexual abuse and sexual offending? Well, I think community matters, full stop, end of story. You know, we often have these debates about whether community values have shifted in the past 30 years and whether we are less community centric and more individualistic as a society currently. But the reason why community matters is people who commit sexual offences come from communities and they go back into communities. And communities can enable sexual abuse, but they can also prevent sexual abuse from happening. So while we think about sexual abuse as an individualistic issue, it's actually a much broader community issue. And hopefully, as we go through this PowerPoint and go through the talk, this is something that you'll see and that you'll hear and that we can ask questions about later on in the Q&A session. So the first thing I would say is sexual abuse is a global issue. And that means a number of things. That means that it's very common and that you will find it in most corners of the world. You will find it in every country in the world and every level of society in the world. that means that it's not an isolated incident, and it's not something that happens to people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sexual abuse is quite widespread. When we look at some of the stats that we hear around sexual abuse, although there are problems with prevalence data, and we'll talk about this in a little minute, but if you look at the recent World Health Organization data that was published maybe 10 days ago on the levels of sexual and interpersonal violence experienced by women globally, it basically talks about how 1 in 3 women globally are impacted by sexual and interpersonal violence at some point in their lives. And because of that, that means that it's A, very common, B, that it affects every part of the world. And so what I and a lot of people in the field are starting to think about now is actually sexual abuse is as much of a pandemic as COVID-19 is. It affects as many people or more people than other pandemics do, and it has consequences not only for their social well-being, but their health and their mental health as well. So what we're going to do in this throughout this conversation is start to think a little bit differently about sexual abuse, starting to think about it as a broader issue that is about something more than individual perpetrators and victims. Start to think about it as a community issue. But also this reinforces and promotes the ideas of Together for Childhood, which is a place-based community intervention which really brings people on board to think about and to talk about and to interact around sexual abuse, among other things. So talking about the reality of sexual abuse, like this is an old slide, and if I was teaching all the undergraduates, I would be saying, oh well, you can't use references that are more than 5 years old, but this is one of the best pictorial representations of the scale of the problem that I think that we have. We know that sexual abuse is underreported and underrecorded. We know that most people report childhood sexual abuse in adult life because they're better able to understand it, better able to process it, articulate it, better able to navigate the system and what it means. Sometimes that's because the person who's committed the abuse against them has passed on. Maybe they're feeling braver. Maybe they realize that other people were impacted by the same person or the same issues. So when we talk about the rates of sexual abuse, we have always got to keep in mind that there are more broad and more widespread than we think that there is. So what we often see in prevalence studies is an estimation of what we think it looks like. And this is part of the problem, that when we start thinking about conviction and when we start thinking about prison and reintegration, we're dealing with a smaller population here because we're dealing with the people who have been caught. So they've been reported to the police have investigated, they've put together a case, they've taken the case to the CPS has said there's enough in this for a prosecution. That prosecution's went to court and the victim has won and the individual has been sentenced. Now we know from recent narratives that actually the CPS aren't processing as many cases as they have done previously, that there's a bit of a challenge and an issue around the processing of sexual abuse cases and what that means for the victim and the perpetrator. Now we've got to put our critical heads on, and when they turn around and say actually there's less cases going through, there might well be less cases going through because there's less cases getting reported, not necessarily because there's less cases that the police are taking forward. So there's lots of different explanations for this, but this I think highlights the issue. If you look at the estimated number of victims in this, so for all sexual offences, they are thinking that it is between 430,000 and 517,000, which results in 5,620 convictions. So there is a massive gap and massive attrition gap between people being a victim of sexual abuse and people receiving a conviction or winning in court. Now, this is important because if that prevalence rate is significantly higher, that means more people are affected by sexual abuse, which means that sexual abuse is more common in our communities and in our lives than we may want it to be and may recognize. And, I think it's safe to say that if you move outside of your work conversations to your personal life, most of us know someone who has been impacted by sexual or interpersonal violence at some point in their lives. So it's really important to start thinking about the, sexual abuse as more widespread than we actually think that it is. And that matters because if we're saying that it's more common and it's more widespread, then what we're saying is the people that we categorize as vulnerable victims and deviant, abnormal perpetrators, that archetype can't be realistic because there is so much sexual abuse within society that the reality is people committing and people being victims of sexual abuse are impacted in it in different ways and that they don't fit those stereotypes and archetypes. More and more people who are victims and perpetrators of sexual abuse look like everyone else rather than abnormal or deviants. So what this means is that we need to start thinking about the way that we engage with society and the way that we tackle issues. And generally in the field of sexual abuse, we tend to think about the individual and relationships. We tend to think about the victim. We tend to think about the perpetrator. So that individual, who they are, the context in which they exist in, the relationship between the two of them, but we often don't go into community or into societal because quite often it means significant changes. If we compartmentalize sexual abuse about vulnerable people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time and deviant antisocial perpetrators, then it means that the community is not at fault. It means that society is not at fault. We can package those people up and continue living our lives in the way that we are without really having to think about and reflect upon how we as a community respond to sexual violence, how we interact to support victims, how we interact to hold people who are being abusive and being problematic in their behaviours to account and to support them from not harming others. And also societal, we have started to see the shift in terms of the Me Too movement and conversations around sexual abuse and sexual harassment. But the question is, have those conversations gone far enough? Are we really tackling with the issue at a community and societal level? And the good thing about Together for Childhood is although it does that individual and relationship work, it's really targeting that community level and saying, how do communities come together to prevent sexual abuse and interpersonal violence and make sure that their children and all individuals actually within society and within that community are protected and safeguarded. So one of the things that we've started to really embrace, and it's interesting because a lot of this work is quite old. So if you've ever studied or looked at criminology or psychology, sort of developmental psychology and developmental criminology are not a new phenomenon. And they really talk about how people change over their life course and the things that contribute to who we are. And it gets into that interesting debate that we often have about nature versus nurture. So are you born evil, or are you created evil by the context in which you live? And that debate often goes backwards and forwards, and we sort of always agree a middle ground, don't we, where we say, well, it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. But this has some challenges, which makes the debate quite interesting, because what it means is, if it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, your background and your physiology and your personality and your psychology all come together to make you who you are, that means there's not a one-size-fits-all model to this. This means that we have to look at the individual and that we have to start thinking about how the individual reacts not only with their environment, but with the people in their environment. Therefore, we need to start thinking about tailored responses, bespoke responses. We need to start thinking about the ways in which different people react to different situations. And what we've ended up seeing, certainly in criminology, is this work has been going on for a long period of time, with things like the Cambridge study with David Farrington and Donald West talking about life course trajectories. And we know that from their research and from research by people like Terry Moffat, that actually the majority of people age out of crime. But there's a small committed group of individuals who become life course persistent offenders who are in and out of the system constantly, and they take up the vast majority of resources. It's a little bit like GP surgeries in the NHS. The vast majority of us go and see our doctors a couple of times a year, need a bit of help and a bit of support, but we're generally able to manage our health reasonably well ourselves. But there's a smaller group of individuals with complex health needs that take up the vast majority of GP's time and their resource and their capability. So what you end up seeing is that in crime and in criminal justice, there is a smaller group of more complex individuals with greater needs that actually take up the vast majority of time in the system and need the most support and the most management. So what is this support and this management? What does it look like? What does it try to do? Well, generally speaking, it tries to balance out two things: risk factors and protective factors. So risk factors are things that are likely to increase the likelihood of you committing an offence. So these can be things like socioeconomic status, major life events, personality, intelligence, impulsivity, socialization. And then there's protective factors. And what's funny is everyone says, oh, well, risk factors and protective factors are opposites of each other. Well, they are and they aren't. They're cut from the same cloth. But protective factors are the things that we have which stop us from committing offences. So a strong family unit, a sense of community, opportunities for support and engagement. And what we see in every individual that we come into contact with, these different risk factors and protective factors are at play within them. And how they balance these out really helps determine whether they go on to commit an offence or whether they don't. And why is all of this important, right? And so you might be saying, yeah, this is great, and we really understand this, but what has this got to do with Together for Childhood, and how does this relate to prevention? It relates to because if we know the things, the risk factors that make people more likely to commit a sexual offence either against a child or neglect or abuse, if we know what some of those factors are and we can identify them in people, we can work with those people at risk of committing an offence to prevent them from committing an offence, to build in protective factors, to build in support that reduce the impact of the risk factors and make it less likely that they're going to commit an offence. What we know from research and practice is when you've talked to people who have committed offences, especially people who have been through treatment programs and interventions, they'll talk about what got them to the point where they committed an offence. We've got to be able to use that information to build safeguards in so that we can prevent and protect people from abuse. So what we've seen in the last few years is a shift towards an amalgamation of health and criminal justice. And it's funny in a way because we have talked about risk factors and we have talked about Farrington and West and the work that they've done. But in the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a real marrying of justice. We're starting to look through offending behaviour and criminal justice through a health lens. So offending behaviour is starting to be seen as an outcome of problematic development, problematic health, problematic support. And so you've probably heard a lot of these conversations of late around things called adverse childhood experiences. And this is really this coming together in this meeting of health and justice as a way of understanding the reality of people's development, their upbringing, marrying together that nature and nurture in a way that helps the system and professionals understand and work with people either at risk of committing an offence or people who have committed an offence. And certainly within Scotland and within Wales, they have really embraced adverse childhood experiences, and they've really started to think about them in their national policies around health, social care and justice. Northern Ireland and England are a little bit later to the game, and certainly in England there's a widespread difference, but geographically you go to different counties and different parts of the country of England and you see very different practices within it. So what are some of these adverse childhood experiences? Well, they tend to fall into three categories. Abuse, which includes physical abuse, emotional abuse and sexual abuse. Neglect, which includes physical and emotional neglect. And household dysfunction, which includes mental illness, an incarcerated relative, a mother treated violently, substance abuse and divorce. And research from internationally, from the UK, from the US, from Australia as well, shows that adverse childhood experiences can contribute to problematic behaviour in later life. Now, we've got to be careful about this because not everyone who has an adverse childhood experience will go on to have problematic behaviour in their own lives. And we've got to think about these as risk factors, so we do, and we've got to think about how we counterbalance these with the protective factors. So you might have people who grow up in a household where there's physical and sexual abuse, but they have a really strong peer group who support them through it, or they have high levels of resilience, or they have other protective factors which can counterbalance some of the problematic outcomes of the adverse childhood experiences. So you might have one person who has multiple adverse childhood experiences, but has high levels of resilience, has high levels of other protective factors, and aren't impacted by those range of adverse experiences in the same way. But you may have another individual who suffers from just one adverse childhood experience, but it's so traumatic, there's such a lack of other protective factors there that it has such a massive impact on them. So to me, I always think about adverse childhood experiences as a bit of a red flag, and it's an opportunity to intervene and a way for us to think about how we can help and support individuals rather than it being a cast iron rule. But what are some of the impacts of ACEs and why do they matter? Well, research has shown that adverse childhood experiences work to rewire your brain. They put you into a permanent state of fight or flight. And we know that we don't always make our best decisions where we're not thinking coherently, when we're not thinking straightforwardly, and when we're reacting to things around us. Now, the problem and the benefit of this is if adverse experiences rewire the brain, what this means is with the right support and with the right time frame, you can undo those changes. You can reverse the negative consequences of adverse childhood experiences, which is why early intervention matters, which is why working with vulnerable and at-risk groups matters, and identifying potential problems early on. So the reality becomes, while we know that they have adverse childhood experiences have lasting impacts upon people, We also know that through psychoeducational approaches, through cognitive behavioral therapy and other types of interventions, we can reverse the impact, or at least reduce the impact, of some of these adverse experiences. But the outcomes of these can be the psychological, social, harming behaviors that actually result in a shorter lifespan, that result in ongoing health conditions, and can have a negative ongoing impact upon the person who is suffering from them. So when we look at the impact of childhood trauma, and I think this is a really good slide because it sort of pinpoints some of the key areas around this, we're thinking about the impact of cognition, on physical health, on emotions, on relationships, on mental health, on behavior, on brain development. So adverse experiences can significantly impact people, but we got to keep in mind that not everyone is impacted in the same way. So what I would just say, just closing this section off, certainly in a lot of the research that has been done on adverse childhood experiences, especially in Wales and in Scotland, it's shown that people who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So the study in Scotland pinpointed that with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you're 20 times more likely to end up incarcerated. And the research from Wales shows that you're 1/3 more likely to be in prison or in the criminal justice system with 4 or more adverse experiences. But again, what I would say is it's not cumulative. What to me those 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are saying is that you've got a person with complex and multiple needs that needs support and needs help. You may have someone who has the same level of complex and multiple needs, who is more resilient, who is more adaptive. So we've always got to keep in mind that adverse childhood experiences are a flag for us to say, this is an opportunity to intervene, an opportunity to work with this child or this young person in a way that really will reverse some of the potential harm that their adverse experiences has led them to. So how does this fit into childhood sexual abuse? Now, a lot of research has been done on this, but it's again mainly from the US. There's been a few studies in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, but it's mainly American-based research, so that's quite important to say. So the research has shown that people who commit sexual offences have particularly excessive adverse childhood experiences and trauma. This is estimated to be 15 times higher than those in the general population. And for males and females, they're both males and females who commit sexual abuse both have a higher ACEs than the general population, but that they don't find there's a significant difference between males who commit sexual abuse and females who commit sexual abuse, that they both have over the odds adverse childhood experiences. Childhood sexual abuse was specifically associated with pedophilia, perhaps because childhood sexual abuse is associated with greater cognitive distortion. So you're seeing sexual abuse and sexual trauma sometimes in the past histories of people who go on to commit child sexual abuse as an adult. And Levinson did a study where she compared males in the general population to people convicted of child sexual abuse, and she found that people who had committed child sexual abuse had nearly twice the odds of physical abuse, 13 times the odds of verbal abuse, and more than 4 times the odds of emotional neglect. And this is actually quite important because a lot of this adverse childhood experiences research is starting to talk about the impact of verbal abuse and emotional abuse. And while we'd always package domestic violence and interpersonal violence together, we're starting to pull out some of these different strands or different types or subtypes of domestic and sexual violence, so that we can really start to see the difference between, you know, being a victim of a contact offense, being a victim of emotional abuse, being a victim of verbal abuse, and they all have negative consequences and negative impacts upon people. And why does this matter? Like the $64,000 question and all of this. Why does having adverse childhood experiences, which may result in you going on to commit abuse and neglect yourself as an adult, sometimes child sexual abuse, sometimes domestic violence or interpersonal violence, it raises the estimation or the odds of this. Why does that matter? How does it work? Well, it's about attachment. Like one of the things that I've learned over the years is that actually attachment is everything. And, you know, it's funny going back to that socio-ecological model where we talked about individual and relationships. That's where we tend to think about attachment happening. But we've also got to think about that broader based attachment to community, attachment to other people. And, you know, through the pandemic, we have started to see communities becoming disenfranchised from each other sometimes, other communities bonding together. So the emergence of stronger online communities in lieu of stronger physical communities. But what we're talking about, whether we're talking about 2 people together or 40 people together, we're talking about degrees of attachment. And what the researchers show on, especially Melissa Grady and Jill Levinson's research, and the 2 of them published quite widely in this area, is that adverse childhood experiences lead to insecure attachment, which then can lead to criminogenic needs and problematic behavior resulting in sexual offending. But it can also be much broader than that. It can also be abuse and neglect and other forms of problematic behavior. So the argument is that adverse childhood experiences can lead to insecure attachment, which can lead to problematic engagement in sexual behavior, interpersonal relationships, and other issues in later life. And really what we're trying to do in intervening early and getting the community and individuals to think about this is, how do we build secure attachment in people who have suffered adverse childhood experiences and have poor or problematic attachment? So one of the ways to do this is through a trauma-informed approach. I remember at the start of some of my work in this area, maybe going back about 4 years ago now, we always sort of talked about adverse childhood experiences in the first instance, and then talked about trauma slightly off to the side of something else. But certainly within professional practice, you're starting to see a shift in this. You're starting to see trauma being used as the overarching concept, and adverse childhood experiences being within that overarching concept. Because the idea that suddenly adverse experiences stop when you hit 16, and that these adverse experiences post 16 don't contribute to problematic behavior in later life is ridiculous. So what we're really talking about is the impact of trauma, and adverse childhood experiences are a form of trauma that can impact people. But there are other forms of trauma that we experience either in adulthood or in our 20s and our 30s that shape and influence our behavior in the way that we interact. So what the thinking is around this is, how do we engage people in a trauma-informed way, in a way that really understands and emphasizes our empathy with their situation? One of the best explanations of this that I've ever heard is not asking people what's wrong with you or why did you do that, but actually what happened to you. And if we think about it from a developmental point of view, and if we think about it from a life course point of view, what happened to you influences and shapes what you did and what you have done and what you will do. So it's that core question. So a couple of years ago, I found this quote and I really like it. So I'm just going to read it. In the simplest terms, the concept of trauma-informed care is straightforward. If professionals were to pause and consider the role that trauma and lingering traumatic stress plays in the lives of a specific client population served by an individual, professional, organization, or an entire system, how would they behave differently? What steps would they take to avoid or at least minimize adding new stress or inadvertently reminding their clients of their past traumas? How can they better help their traumatized clients heal? In effect, by looking at how the entire system is organized and services are delivered through a trauma lens, what should be done differently? So what being in trauma-informed means is that whether you're working with children who have been a victim of sexual abuse or neglect, or children or adolescents or adults who have committed sexual abuse, violence or neglect, you have to look at their journey and what happened to them and enable them to have the breathing space to be able to talk about their experiences so they can understand how their experiences changed and influenced them and how it shaped the decisions that they've made or the decisions that they're going to make. And there has been a real surgence of trauma-informed approaches, from trauma-informed schools right through to trauma-informed communities and community interventions. So being trauma-informed is about understanding where the individual has come from and using that understanding and knowledge and experience to help develop a bespoke approach that enables them to stop their problematic behavior or to recover from the problematic behavior that they have suffered from. So what are some of the benefits about this? Because so for clients, it's about feeling safe and supported. It's about increased engagement. It's about understanding that symptoms may be linked to childhood trauma and really thinking about the impact that trauma in their own lives, whether adverse childhood experiences or otherwise, has really played in them. Care experiences that do not make things worse. A trauma-informed approach really starts from the premise of do no harm. Don't do things that will make the matter worse. And I think sometimes it's safe to say that in the way that we have engaged historically, not only with children, but with people who have problematic behaviors, that we have sometimes made matters worse. In trying to do good, we have actually made matters worse and created problematic outcomes. Starting a recovery journey is really important as well. And this is why having a life course approach is so important, because everything's a journey. We don't look at things in absence. We don't look at individual events as events. We look at them as events influenced by a person's risk factors, their protective factors, but also them as an individual, their interpersonal relationships, and their broader community. In doing that, we are saying to people that things will improve, that you can get better, that you can start to reverse some of the trauma and some of the damage that is caused. But also being trauma-informed is about an organizational approach. It's a 360 approach, a top-down approach, where the entire organization and their partners have to be engaged. That's why Better Together, to me, feels like it's trauma-informed. It's about bringing the community together and the multiple agencies together to deal with a common problem from a rounded perspective, where we can work with children and young people who have been harmed and have harmed, where we can work with adults who have harmed as well to really understand the context of it and to prevent it from happening again. So it's a better understanding of people's behaviours. It's a better understanding and more compassion about what's happened. It also, being trauma informed, means offering support to staff, staff well-being, staff engagement, staff development. So it reduces burnout. We know from research that people who work in high-end risky probation and high-end risky social work tend to burn out quite quickly and are leaving the professions within the first 5 years. And actually, that's not good for them, but that's not good for us as organizations who work with and engage with people who have experienced or caused harm. Agencies developing clear frameworks of values, better engagement with clients, better staff retention, reduce sickness and absence. So there's a lot of benefits to being trauma informed that not only help the client, but also help staff and help the organization as well. But what this means is that we have to shift our perception of the person that we have in front of us. Being trauma informed and recognizing the impact of adverse childhood experiences and past trauma means that we have to engage with the service user in a different way, which means that we have to start thinking a little bit differently about the people that we have in front of us, certainly within the criminal justice system, you know, and we see this sometimes in victim services as well as perpetrator services. A lot of people who engage with these services feel done to and not done with. So in research that we have done looking at people who people who have committed sexual abuse and child sexual abuse who go through the system, they often feel that they're put on programs, they have no choice in the program, that they're not listened to when they ask questions that they're seen as challenging and difficult. They feel that they go through a process that is done to them rather than with them, and they don't feel that they're part of that. But we also get that with victims. So we did some research in Australia that was funded by ANROS, which is the Australian National Women's Health Research Consortium. And we looked at victims of sexual abuse and their attitudes and understanding to state responses and treatment and reintegration. And quite often they would come back and say, actually, we want the abuse to stop. We want this person to get the help that they need. But they often felt that they were being led down a vengeance pathway. They were being led down a pathway where there was an expectation of what they wanted, which wasn't actually what they wanted, and no one had really asked them what they wanted to happen or how they wanted it to happen. So being trauma informed means that we have to engage more effectively with the service user, however uncomfortable that is. We also have to sort of step back from our professional roles where we go, yeah, but we know best. We may feel that we know best, and we may see the wide variety of options out there, but it's our job to help the service user, whether they're a victim or a perpetrator, engage with the right options in the right way that they feel comfortable with. It's not our role to force options upon them, which can be quite difficult and can be quite challenging. We need taking a trauma-informed approach also means promoting desistance. So desistance, for those of you who aren't aware of it, sort of came from the research of a guy called Shabaruna, and Shad said, you know, you've been asking the wrong question. Because for years we often said, how do we get you to stop doing the thing that we don't want you to do? And the problem is, if you have ever been in a difficult situation or you can't see the way out, you won't know what that looks like. You won't be able to articulate the help that you need. So Shad's argument was, actually, you need to go to people who have stopped offending or got past their trauma or got past their adverse experiences and ask them how they did it, so that you can recalibrate those options for other people, so that you can support them and engage with them in a way that promotes an offence-free lifestyle and encourages resilience and encourages a strengths-based approach. So quite often what this really means is a community-based approach, a holistic approach. Quite often in criminal justice, we talk about social capital, but there is much, much more to this than just social capital. So in research from the drugs field, you end up seeing this thing called recovery capital. And, you know, it's about social capital, cultural capital, physical capital, and human capital. And in drugs rehabilitation and addiction rehabilitation, they talk about how you need to achieve improvements in all 4 areas of capital to actually improve your recovery. Myself and a colleague, Hazel Kemshaw, wrote a paper on this that came out last year, where we talked about how recovery capital can be used to get us to think about sexual abuse and child sexual abuse, and actually promoting the assistance and integration of people who've committed that abuse back into the community. And it's this rounded, holistic view of what community values are, and how people who have committed harm to others either fall in line or don't fall in line with those community values, and how we as a community can help rebuild cultural capital and promote human capital and physical capital as well. So the prevention of sexual abuse, whether it's first-time prevention or whether it's preventing reoffending, is a community issue. And that's why the Together for Childhood project is really important, because quite often one of the reasons why abuse continues and why people don't get the support that they need, either as a victim or as a perpetrator, is because people are silent about abuse, that communities are silent about abuse, because we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to engage around it. So if we start to think about sexual abuse as a community issue, that means that we have to talk about it. That means we have to put interventions in place, that we have to think in a coordinated way. So thinking about sexual abuse as a community issue, so moving it away from just an individual and interpersonal issue to a community issue, means that we can do something about it, but also means it's not as scary as a societal issue, which makes it feel too big and too much out of the scope of everyone. If a community can come together to engage around this, then actually they can make some really proactive and concrete changes. So again, just reminding you of the social ecological model. So it is an individual issue, it is a relationship issue, but we're focusing on this community issue just for the minute. So the argument is what we need to do to actually prevent and support people who have experienced sexual abuse, but also interpersonal violence and other forms of abuse, is to shift away from a criminal justice approach. A criminal justice approach is after the fact. The damage has already been done. You're talking about individual victims, individual perpetrators. It's very professionally orientated. It's quite punitive in the way that it responds to things, and it's very systems driven. Where if you take an epidemiological criminology approach, which is a big word and a complicated word to say, but the reality of it is, epidemiology is the study of populations, and I think we're all well versed in epidemiology now by the time that we get to the end of this pandemic. But it's looking at crime as a population community level issue. So it's about framing it in terms of health. It's about framing it in terms of community engagement, in terms of education. It's about prevention as well as reaction. It's about being proactive. It's about thinking about individuals, but thinking about them within the context of communities. So it's broadening that socio-ecological model from just individual and interpersonal up to the full-scale model of individual, interpersonal, community, and societal. And this is starting to gain traction at the minute. We're seeing a lot of conversations about violence reduction units. We're seeing conversations about how Public Health England and how the MOJ and how the Home Office can work together in tandem, and what some of these interrelationships are, and how we can think about violence prevention in a health framework. So what does this mean in terms of prevention? So there's 4 levels of prevention. Primary prevention is those broad-based public messages, and I think that's a place where the NSPCC quite often sits. So television ad campaigns, awareness raising campaigns, talking about the reality of sexual abuse, offering support and insights into it, dispelling myths, that broad-based messaging. Secondary is an area that we don't do a lot of work in. Secondary is about working with people who are in at-risk populations, either at risk of committing a sexual offence or risk of being a victim of a sexual offence. Quite often, like what we see in this space, certainly in the UK, is you might have something like STOPSO, which is Stop Sexual Offending, or Lucy Faithfull Foundation and their prevention work, or Nottingham Trent and the Safer Living Foundation. Some examples of that from secondary prevention internationally might be the Duncanville Project, or Help Wanted in the US. So it's about working with people who are on the cusp of committing an offence and actually thinking about how we can offer them help and support, either as an individual or as a community. Tertiary is after the fact, is after the abuse has happened, and this is something we do a lot. It looks like sexual offence treatment programs and interventions. It looks a little bit like probation, the work that's done in prisons and in the community. It's about helping people understand why they have sexually offended and how they can best prevent their sexual offending. And there's quaternary, which is mitigating against the negative outcomes of over medicalization or over criminalization. It's about that long tail when people come out of the system and they go back into communities, and how communities interact and respond and engage with that. And something like circles of support and accountability, who I know are talking, I think Jamie's talking later on today, sort of fit into that model and how it helps us think about it. But really what Together for Childhood is doing and should strive to do is tackle all 4 of these areas. It's about raising awareness of the reality of sexual abuse, neglect and violence, how it affects young people, how it affects communities, the lasting consequences of it. It's about identifying people who have certain risk factors and working with them by providing protective factors that actually help them. And these risk and protective factors are not only about professional services, they're also about communities giving support and mentoring and well-being. It's about, after the fact, when unfortunately sexual abuse does occur, about how support is provided within the community and within the area to help victims deal with what has happened to them and help perpetrators understand the ways that they can go forward not offending. And it's about providing that community integration and support, that sexual abuse is not taboo, that it's talked about, that it's understood, and that victims don't feel further victimized and perpetrators don't feel further isolated. It's about building communities of resilience and communities of well-being and knowledge. But one of the most important and significant ways that we can do this is through everyone on this call, because we need to value professional knowledge. So you have someone like me who rocks up and tells you all this stuff, and that's great, but you are on the front lines. You have that practice-based knowledge, and it's about how you use that practice-based knowledge of being in communities and working in communities, how that enables you to understand the communities that you work with and actually not only stop sexual offending and deal with the consequences of sexual offending, but prevent sexual offending in moving forward. So just in closing, I just want to again say thank you for the invitation. I've really enjoyed being able to come back and talk with you, and I'm very happy to take some questions. And I see Oliver has returned.
Thank you, Kieran. I guess just a really quick reflect from me is just what an incredible, I guess, felt like a call to action from you there in terms of the information that was shared to everyone on the call, but just so much amazing information covered in such a short space of time. I'm sure everyone else would agree. I could have spent all day sort of listening and actually then getting into debates about this, but I guess this is the important thing. This week and this opening session is that real call to action around let's keep talking, because the most important thing is let's not make this taboo anymore. Let's talk about all aspects of this. And I think that was what really struck me in your talk, was around thinking about people who potentially go on to offend. They're individuals in their own right. They've experienced things in their own right. They've been on their own journey. How do we reframe how we look at those people in front of us and really help them to reintegrate, to be part of community? It was a real call to action that embedding this in community is the only way we're going to really make any change. So it was just quite an inspiring start to the week.
Like, one of the things that often strikes me, Oliver, is it's a little bit like drug addiction treatment. So the best way on methadone, or the best way to get treatment or support, is to be caught with drugs on you. So why should you have to commit abuse and have a victim of abuse to get help to stop you from committing abuse? It seems so counterintuitive to me. So that if we know some of these things and we know some of these experiences, how can we build communities that actually want to intervene and want to help and want to support and say, actually, you need someone to talk to, or you need some help. Let's think about how we can get that. So actually you don't have another victim, because once you have a victim, the damage is done. That person's life has been completely impacted. I was going to say derailed, but you can't categorize how victims think and feel. It's very individual for each of them. But the reality is, if there was a way to stop that victimization from happening, shouldn't we at least try to do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also kind of really struck me about, perhaps we've come a long way in sort of, especially in terms of the reframing of trauma and trauma-informed practice. And I think we're really fortunate. So you really hit a nerve there and I'm sure a lot of colleagues on the call who are part of the trauma-informed city movement in Plymouth would have been sat here today going, yes, what we're building is sort of creating the conditions for all of this stuff, this prevention work to happen. But I think it also, I'm not going to hog the field because other people ask questions, but I think it was also interesting around, we need to be bolder. We need to go further. We need to kind of, those messaging around, which I think the only one I'm aware of is Germany at the moment, where they put out public broadcasts around for people to to signpost people to go and get help or confidential help if they're having inappropriate thoughts around harm and harming. So there's so much, isn't there, still to be sort of ground to cover. But I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna go to my colleagues Kieran and Shelley to sort of maybe pick out. I could see there's also someone with their hand up, so I'm just going to scan over the questions. Kieran, Shelley, did you have any specific questions you wanted to pull out? I'm appreciating that we haven't even given Kieran 2 minutes breathing space, so that's probably a bit mean.
Kieran, there's a really interesting question on here from Sarah Cox. And Sarah's asked, is there any difference in the research between people who offend online to those that undertake contact offences? Is there one community approach for both? Are the risks and protective factors similar for both?
There's a whole can of worms. So you've asked the complex question there, Sarah. So the simple answer is yes and no. So what we know is that there are similar but different risk factors for people who offend online and for people who offend who contact offend. Like, a lot of the work that's been done around this, so people like Hannah Meriden, Derek Perkins, who have done a lot of work on this, that they really say that you've got to look at the individual, because some people only offend online and they have no desire to actually commit a contact offence, where for others, they actually want to commit a contact offence and it's a pathway for them to do that. And I think that's really important, because I think that there was a period there where everyone thought, well, if you're downloading child sexual abuse material, you're obviously on a pathway to committing a contact offence, and that's obviously what you want. But I think a lot of the research by not only Hannah, but people like Michael Cito and work coming out of his lab show that not everyone is on that pathway. So some people are, but others aren't. But the risk factors are generally the same across the board. And, you know, this is the thing about sexual abuse and child sexual abuse. We have created an industry, or we have created a viewpoint that these people are significantly different from the rest of us. They're completely abnormal. Even compared to burglars and car thieves, they're completely different. But the reality is all the risk factors are the same. They just play out in different ways. So what you would probably be looking at is, if you were starting to think about, actually, is someone at risk of downloading and viewing material, it would be about thinking about their internet usage, unhealthy attitudes, their ways of being online and the way that they engage online. But, you know, those factors are still the same, you know, the abuse, neglect, maybe personality, developmental factors, and other things like that. So there is crossover, but it's very difficult to say that actually it's these three risk factors linked to this category and these three risk factors linked to that category. I would strongly encourage, you know, thinking about risk factors and looking at the individual and saying, actually, there's a few things that have come up here which feel like a bit of a warning sign. So let's do a bit more digging around this, because that's what the risk factors should be. They shouldn't be an absolute. They should be saying, here's a bit of a red flag. We need to do something around this. Let's engage with this person to see what that intervention may look like to help them.
Yeah. More importantly, going back to your point, Kieran, like, let's always bring it back to the individual sat in front of us. What's their journey been, and what could their future journey be if we intervene in the right way? Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. I'm just looking to we'll pull out a couple more of the types questions in a minute, but I'm noticing not everyone's got access to a chat function sometimes. I'm seeing that someone called Elaine White has got their hand up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I work for young people's substance misuse services, and I just found that absolutely brilliant, because historically I've also worked in the prison service. And actually, like the Just Say No campaign didn't work. You know, you're judging people, and actually you've got to come alongside them to actually understand them. And it was just really refreshing to hear about you saying, actually asking what's happened to you rather than what can we do to change you, in terms of actually how we make a difference to people, because it's that relationship building, non-judgmental rather than punitive, that actually does encourage people to change. Yeah. So I just really want to say hats off to what you're doing.
Thank you. And it's really, well, it's not funny, but it's really interesting, because we spend a lot of time thinking about safeguarding and how we protect communities and how we stop people from offending and how people change their lives. But you have to bring people with you. It's about motivation to change, you know. And that's an easy conversation to have in drug services, where you go, well, actually, you have to be motivated, you have to be engaged, you have to realize that you've got a problem, you have to realize that you want to do something about it, and then we can support you in that. And I do feel that drug services have come a longer way, but I still think once you get into sexual abuse and neglect and violence, people aren't that open to talking about it. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge that they've got a problem, because we have spent so much time characterizing people who commit abuse as fundamentally different from us, so that they don't want to be seen in that way. But you have to be motivated and you have to want to change, and doing stuff to people doesn't motivate them to change. Like when I teach undergraduate, I always think, right, how do we relate criminal behavior to our everyday life? And say you smoke, or say you drink too much, or say, you know, you really like having McDonald's every day for your lunch. You know, if someone comes up to you and says you need to stop doing that and you're not motivated, you will go out of your way to avoid doing that. Or if you do it, it'll be through gritted teeth and you won't be happy about it. And any opportunity that you have to push back in whatever way, you will do that. But if someone comes to you and says, this is why, and I understand why you're doing this, and I understand the reasons for this, and here I'm going to help you just realize that that's not good for you, then you're more likely to bring people with you. So I think, Elaine, I think motivation is such a key word, and it's something that we don't think about a lot in criminal justice, because, you know, we sort of see treatments and interventions as a fait accompli, that they have to do them. But, you know, they do have to do stuff and they have to engage in change, but we have to bring them with us.
And we just have to act like we're not better than them.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Elaine, for raising that really, really important point, and Kieran for that response. Really interesting. Just coming back to, we've got a little bit of time left for a couple more questions. I'm just going to revert to, because I haven't had my eye on all of the questions. Kieran, have you got any other questions you wanted to pick out from the chat bar?
Yeah, there's some interesting conversations. So Sarah Saunders and Liam and others are asking specifically about differences, if any, between the populations of male and female offenders. So things about kind of specific risk factors. And I think it's Liam that makes the point that he understands that many of the structured risk assessments in development and use currently were not based on female populations. Just some thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, you know, definitely, you know, certainly within the field, we haven't been great at diversifying a lot of risk assessment tools, you know. And certainly initially, a lot of the stuff were based on males and what we knew about males. And actually that doesn't translate not only into women, but it doesn't translate into ethnic minorities, and it doesn't translate into young people as well, because there are different factors at play there. But what we see is that men and women respond to trauma in different ways. Men tend to externalize. So men get into fights, they cause trouble, they become more criminogenic in that sense, where women tend to internalize their trauma a lot more. They tend to self-harm more, they tend to turn to drugs and alcohol a lot more than men do. So trauma plays out in different ways in different genders. But one of the problems is, once you get, you know, I think we tend to talk about male perpetration of sexual abuse more because it is more than likely more common, but it's also because we, to use Oliver's words, we frame female sexual abuse of children in a very different way. So men who sexually abuse children are evil, demonic, abusive, horrible individuals, where women are mentally unstable, mentally damaged. That's not really their fault. They don't really understand what they're going on. So one is characterized as an evil, sadistic choice, and the other one's characterized as a mental health issue. We also know that when a lot of women who have committed offences enter the system, they tend to be rooted into mental health outcomes a lot more than men who are rooted into criminal justice outcomes as well. So, but also, you know, like my favorite hobby, and people always laugh at me when I say this, is I like to read the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, because actually it just really reinforces in me how much further we have to travel to get into this conversation. So, you know, the way that women who sexually abuse young girls and young boys are characterized, you know, if you look at the same newspaper story about a teacher who sexually abuses a child in their care, you will see a very different story about a male teacher and a female student than you will about a female teacher and a male student. And that's really problematic, because what that means is that it's reinforcing the notion that females who sexually abuse are somehow different, they're more problematic, they're less harmful, and actually sexual abuse is harmful regardless of who perpetrates it. So I think we've got other issues that compound the problem about thinking about females who sexually abuse and sexually harm. They've got similar risk factors. They've got similar protective factors, but it plays out in different ways for them. I don't know if I've answered the question. I've just talked randomly for 5 minutes, but
no. I think it was, thanks, Kieran. I think you did, and thank you for the questions, importantly, because actually they're really kind of helping us to kind of go even deeper into this debate in this session. So I thank you for that. I'm just gonna pause a second and I'm just scanning through, Kieran, to see if I could pick up, check that no one else has got their hand up or asking a question.
I think there was a question quite early on that links to the point around motivation. So the question was, how can we meaningfully incorporate service users' voices into prevention initiatives, given potential for denial, cognitive distortions to justify own behaviour?
I think that's a really important question. And I think one of the ways that we can do this is in thinking about how we react and respond to people who have been through the system, have been through treatments and been through interventions. So getting them, people who have been through the system, saying, this is the help that I would have needed, this is how you could have reached out to me, and that would have ticked this box. I think going to people in the community and saying, okay, anyone who's at risk of committing a sexual offence, what help do you need? You'll terrify people and they'll go down rabbit holes and they won't respond. But taking that sort of desistance approach of saying, actually, what help would you have needed? How could we have reached out to you in a way that would have been really useful? So for instance, you think about something like the Safer Living Foundation, right? And they've got their version of Duncanfeld that they're trying to get off the ground, which is an in-person service in Nottingham where people can go in and ask for help. Now, you might have people who say, I want help, but I'm not prepared to do that. I would never have walked into a building to do that, but I want it online. Or I want a sort of distance learning approach or something like that. I think you have to engage with people who have committed abuse. You have to talk with them once they've been through the process and they understand the ramifications of what they've done and said, how could we have helped you get to that point? And I do think the issue about denial and cognitive distortions is really important. And, you know, you see the conversation taking place where really early on people will deny their behavior. We see it in ourselves. You know, if you're on the cusp of something, you'll play it down, then you'll make it an intervention, or someone might say to you, actually, you know what, you're being really out of line, and that sort of jolts you and you go, oh, actually, hold on. So if you're someone who's viewing online child sexual abuse material, or you're thinking about committing a contact offence, and you're in chat groups and you're doing all of this stuff, you will engage with things that reinforce your behaviour and your worldview. You're not going to go and talk about it with someone who's going to go, actually, no, that makes you problematic, or that makes you a deviant, or that makes you X, Y, and Z. So thinking about people who have been through the system and saying, how can we frame this conversation in a way that would have appealed to you 5 years ago when you were on the cusp of doing this, I think is one of the ways forward. And I think we need to do more of that work with different populations in different ways, because that conversation, you know, going back to the male versus female perpetration, but that conversation also looks different in ethnic minority communities as well, and in different social levels. It's really funny because I think people always talk about hard to reach populations. Middle class populations are the hardest to reach populations because they don't believe that this happens in their communities. Well, I think a lot of working class populations, while they don't want to acknowledge it and they're not happy to acknowledge it, they have a much better realistic worldview of what's actually going on.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Again, we just keep. I mean, what's amazing is this debate at the end here, as I thought it would. We're kind of almost starting to create, a rallying call to focus more on the areas that you've highlighted and more on the areas of sort of wider public understanding. Because if we create the conditions for understanding, we're gonna kind of be able to make a difference and put all the services, the different gaps in place. I'm just thinking we need to sort of start to, I'm afraid, look at the process of wrapping up today's session, this first session of this week. So I want to kind of just raise a couple of important points to close off, is to say that this is just the start of this conversation. Kieran's literally ignited a flame, I think, today, which is amazing around this. And I think really kickstarted it in such an energetic way. And I want to just give another. I've seen the thanks already pouring in on the chat bar. So you're hopefully feeling the love there, Kieran, around what you've started here in terms of debate. I want to kind of signal everyone to become part of. It's in the clue is in the name. Together for Childhood is us here today, being in it together and working together to prevent child sex abuse. The partnership's already broad, but we're welcoming people all the time. You can get involved. So please get in touch with our NSPCC office here in Plymouth. Look at what we're doing on our social media, Facebook page. Get in contact with us that way, any way you choose, and get involved and help us shape up the program in Plymouth so that we can learn and roll out new ways of working far and wide. I want to give a slight talk about my trauma around the technology around delivering this week. And just, I've noticed quite a few people, and massive apologies. I know a lot of people may have joined late today because we had a slight technological meltdown at the very end of last week with the format that we were going to be delivering these sessions in. So I needed, Shelley kindly reminded me, say something. So I needed to just say to everyone, sorry about that firstly, but also if you've booked on to other sessions, Kieran mentioned earlier, we've got sessions happening all week. We've got circles Southwest this afternoon, which will pick up on what agencies do working with people at risk of offending this afternoon. Please check your emails because we sent out another late email at the end of last week with new joining links on that timetable of events. So please go back and reference that so that you're in the right Teams room in the sessions that you've booked on later in the week. Yeah, I'm getting loads of responses here. There's lots of people asking about the presentation and about the information. The session's been recorded. We're also going to be gathering up all the resources that we're allowed to sort of share and package up, along with a really important evaluation. I know the dreaded evaluation, which we're always asked, but it's really important if people complete it, and we'll be circulating that around next week once we've delivered all of the sessions this week. But I just want to say a massive thank you again to Kieran. I know, when we talked about you being involved in this and you remember visiting Together for Childhood just when it was kicking off, it's amazing really how far we've come in such a short space of time to be engaging so many people in this debate, which might have 2 years ago felt like it was, we weren't ready to get into this level of debate around changing the paradigm around how we see offending and how we see problematic or harmful behaviors. But we've moved a long way in a short space of time. So I think you've really kicked off the week incredibly well, Kieran. So big thank you. And thank you to everyone who's engaged. Yeah.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for inviting me. And I just suppose, the last thing I would just say to everyone, in childhood and preventing childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, or community issues. We are social beings. We live in communities together. So the more that we can tackle the problem as a community, the less isolated individuals who have either experienced it or are perpetrating it feel, and the better able they are to get support and help. So I hope you really enjoy the rest of your week, and I hope that the rest of the conference goes well.
Thanks, Kieran. Thank you. Okay, on that really, really important last message, I'm going to say farewell to people for this session, but probably see you in a Teams room later on, either this afternoon or in other parts of this week ahead. Thank you, and I will now start to ask everyone to sign out and leave.